As we approach Yom Kippur, Abba Aleinu L'Tova, so I'd like to discuss about something relating to Yom Kippur, which also has ramifications for the area of medicine in general, and in particular certain medical debates that we hear about lately. And it's also actually related in certain respect to Hilchos Nida, which is being learned here as well. As we know, as we all know, when it comes to eating on Yom Kippur, and in continuation to Rabbi Shiur 2 days ago, where he went into many of the practical details, eating and Shiurim. So we know there's a discussion from the Gemara and onwards about the role of doctors and their directives, their instructions, their prescriptions. And the question we're going to discuss is what actually is the maskana la halacha when it comes to Yom Kippur, and generally in halacha, and generally in medicine, and is there a difference between different situations? So let's take a quick look at Siman Tafresh Yud Ches in the Alter Rebbe. So in Sif Gimel, the Alter Rebbe says if one doctor says that a person should eat, another doctor says he should not. So if then the person himself has no say, has nothing to add to the conversation. So we say that he should eat because safek nefashis lahakol, right? So it sounds like when you have a 50-50 dilemma, so lahakol, we're makel on the expense of Yom Kippur in order to be more stringent, as we say in Pekuach Nefesh. Daled, again, if the patient himself has nothing to say, and here it's one doctor saying to eat versus two doctors who say not to eat, then he doesn't eat. We follow the majority, 2 against 1. Right now it's not 50-50 anymore. What if the one who says to eat is muflag b'chachma, he's a medical giant, versus the other 2? So then, once again, we take his words into account and we let the patient eat. It's a suffix of kanastafasha. So it sounds like we turn it back. We consider it to be a 50-50 proposition. So sounds like that's the rule, 50-50. So now comes Sivhei with a chiddush. And if it's 2 doctors who say to eat versus 100 doctors who say not to eat, and even in this case, even if the patient is also saying he doesn't have to eat, we still make him eat. And even if the ones who say no are greater experts and more advanced than the 2 who say to eat, when it comes to safek nefashos, we actually do not follow the majority of chachma or the majority of doctors. Lahachmir, as long as we have 2 who are adequate medical practitioners, we consider them to be chachamim uflagim, and Alter Rebbe, other places can compare it to Eidos, where you have 2 Eidim against 100. Xeris HaKasav is that it doesn't matter how many you have once you hit the number 2. So the same principle applies to doctors on Yom Kippur. Then Sivav says, and by the way, the identity of the doctor, the gender or their nationality doesn't matter. If it's an Isha or a Nachri, same, no effect on the count. Doesn't matter what kind of doctor they are. And could be makhish, they can go up against toe-to-toe with the Reifei HaKosher Shabbat Yisrael. So when you read this halacha, it sounds pretty much, if you had to just summarize, it sounds like we're pretty reliant on whatever doctors say. Only problem is sometimes you're stuck in between. You don't know. One doctor says this, one doctor says that, 2 doctors, etc. So that's why Allah comes up with certain rules, certain principles of how to actually make a decision. So now the question would be, what about other halachic cases? What about general medical questions? However, before we even get to that, you could open open a Mishnah Brura to see where halacha sort of progressed, how it moved on after the Alter Rebbe. So you open the Mishnah Brura and the Bir Halacha, and the Bir Halacha writes, what it says in Shulchan Aruch, even a guy, so you look and say for Tiferes Yisrael, and by this Yitaka means the regular Tiferes Yisrael on Mishnayos, Yisrael Lipschitz of Germany, and if you look at Yom Parikhes Mishnah Hey, Tiferes Yisrael writes, the Ha'idna, even though he also writes, I feel good, and he adds, the Ha'idna Yeshlis Yashav B'davar. Nowadays we actually have to rethink this a bit. I myself have seen that the Lashon usually in Chazal is that they don't want to lose their reputation as honest medical practitioners, but I have seen that they don't give honest answers. For every mild illness, they always say, oh, if he's going to fast, it's going to be dangerous, it's going to be harmful. So Tiferes Yisrael lost his faith in the doctors that he was asking. And if you look in the end of the Parak, Hilchsa Gevirta, where the Tiferes Yisrael summarizes the halachas, so again, and there he just writes Afilu Goy without any comment, but his son, who I believe brought the Sefer to print, adds in Hagah that if you look what my father wrote, Rabbeinu Haggadah wrote in Tiferes, Ha'idna Yishlis Yashav, etc., and he adds, Vani B'noi V'Talmidoi. I'm going to add that today we see that even the Reifa Yisrael, that the majority of them are Nisenu Harabim, are Kaifrim B'Torah HaKdosha. So it actually looks like they're just deliberately, out of spite, B'Zdoin Libam L'Hadiach. Looks like they Pashat are out to get us. And when it comes to eating Yisurim, generally, and Bimei Tainus, even worse than Goyish doctors. That's what the Tiferes Yisrael's son writes about his impression of the doctors of his time. Also, I believe in Germany, yeah? Okay. Well, I was going to mention it at some point. We know generally that all actual professional doctors all went for higher education somewhere regardless. Even if they ended up back in Russia, they probably would have also fit in this category. Certainly by the time the Mishnah Berurah was writing the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah then, the Biur Halacha quotes another source, Shutra Matz. What's Shutra Matz? So apparently it's a Rav by the name of Meir Tzvi Wittmeyer. He lived in Galicia in the 1800s. In Shiur, in volume 23, is actually a whole article about his life story, and apparently he was considered one of the Chasheva Meshivim in his Dor, the Chassam Sofer, and Shlomo Kluger. You see, Mamish are writing to him with tremendous respect, but they mentioned already that this is an example of someone whose name totally vanished after he was off the scene. So in Shut Ramatz, Chelik Chaim Siman 39, when he was asked in the year Tizrach, Tofresh Tezvov, the 1850s, about cholera, and these questions kept on coming up. There's a cholera outbreak. What's the story with fasting? And they actually write in his biography that he ultimately himself was a casualty of cholera in 18 years later. So in that Shuv in Ois Yud, although I looked it up, it's an Ois Yud Aleph. So he writes, I just want to speak for a moment about the question of doctors, asking doctors on about fasting on Yom Kippur. The Bisman Hazeh, Tzorech Iyun, Im Nismach Aleim. It's unclear if we should actually rely on them. Even though the Maharik wrote in Sheiresh Kufnun Test that even non-Jewish doctors are reliable, so let's take a look and see what is Taka Maharik from Italy from the 1500s. What does he write about this topic? So the shayla there was that a woman was told by doctors, they claimed that she cannot wash her head with water. It's bad for her. And of course, chafifa, you need water. The shayla was, can they use wine instead? What effect does wine have on the hair? Does it separate the hair, which is what we're looking for, or does it do the opposite? So, among other things, the Mardik says she should ask the same doctors who said not to wash her head with water, ask them, no, what do you think about wine? Would it be like water? Would it not? What effect would it have? And he adds, we find everywhere that Chachamim rely on the Reifim. What's the example? What's the source he brings? Some Nida, Gemara Nida, Amar B'lezer B'Rut Tzaddik. There were two Shnei Dvarim that he's discussing. One is a Maisa B'Isha Achas that kept on expelling these Klipos Adumos. They asked my father asked Chachamim asked the doctors, and they said there's a Makkah. And there was another woman who was expelling Sidus Adumas, and again they asked my father, Chachamim, doctors, and they said again there's some internal reason in her stomach for this. So that's the Gemara. So what the Ma'arik takes away from this Gemara is, it seems like they relied on doctors even where there's a Chash Kares, Hilchas Nida. We'll see later that people have understood the exact opposite from the same Gemara, but that's what Ma'arik says. Emmerich says, you could argue that maybe there it's different because it also, the doctors were confirming what had already seemed obvious, because that's not usually how a woman experiences Dam Nida. But you could say the opposite, Adrabah. You have Shur Shachat Lufneim. The evidence is lying right before them. There are Sidus V'Klipas Adumis, literally right here. It's a Suffolk Kares, and yet we're relying on the doctor. So Kol Shekain over here. And anyway, makes sense to say that we shouldn't distinguish between water and wine. Then he adds, we find Chayla on Yom Kippur. We listen to the doctor. Even if the Chayla says, I don't need, And if not for the doctor, it would be Aser. Maisim Shebachal Yom, that we rely on Reifim, Goyim, La'achila. So that's the Marik. So the Ramatz is quoting the Marik, and he says, even though the Marik wrote what he wrote, but what's the reason? Why do we trust, especially not Jewish doctors? This idea of Loi Meira Umanuse. He doesn't want to hurt his reputation. Because otherwise, why would we care at all about what they have to say? Why would it have halachic significance? So, what does it mean? The Loi Meira Umanuse. So that means he has to be faced with the potential threat of getting a hit to his reputation. So that must be only in cases where sheyuchal his butter hepach dvarav, that there's potential for him to be made to look like a fool. But Kolel Yom Kippur, the doctor knows we're not gonna go and do an experiment. We're not gonna do a study now, and the doctor's gonna say this guy needs to eat, and we're gonna make him fast just to find out whether he really dies. Obviously, we're not going to try that. So he knows he knows we're going to listen to him, and it's enough for him to say chashash sakana. And even if we did the study and he didn't eat and he still lived, he says lo yitafes b'shikrei kamuvan. He's still not going to be caught in a lie. So the only way to disprove the doctor would only be if other experts came along later and disproved. They came and they said, "Oh, this guy, what's he talking about? He doesn't know what he's talking about." But what if we don't expect to have bigger doctors coming and saying the opposite? So that we see the kula b'chad amachta, they're all being mekel again. All the doctors are all saying, "Yeah, eat." And then he's mitzayin to the Rabbi Yosef and Yeridei. It says the kuf pei tes. It's a mistake. Sim kuf pei zayin. If you look there, so the din in kuf pei zayin is about Rosh machmas tashmish, and now the question is, does she have the chance to be nisrapa afterwards to say, you know what, it was a problem, but now we fixed it. So the Sefer, the Sefer Trumas says that refuahs only work before the chazaka. Once there's a chazaka, tzarech chiyun if she can rely on the refuah, even a reifim mumcha. That's what's quoted in the smag, and in the smak, tzarech chiyun, even a Yehudi reifim mumcha if you can rely on him or not. So that's a much more stringent view. And then Hagoyes Marani is quote the smag, and then they say b'shem the ritzvah that if the Reif says that she was healed, if he's a Yisrael, we can rely on what he says. But ein b'yodi lahatir al pi dibur of a goy. Afilu b'roifei mumcha l'rabim. The loy made an afshe, seemingly a big mumcha. He doesn't do this. That's the principle. He doesn't want to hurt himself. The karinim b'hu asher piem diber shav. Lies, all lies. That's what the Ritzvah says. He's the more lenient position in that stance in that debate. Then it adds, if Taka seems like Pasuk Dam Besta, and the Re'iyah through the Refuahs, it seems like the Refuahs are having an effect. You could see sort of the cause and effect. Then maybe you could rely even on the guy, the Dovid say Yesh Refuah. Okay. Well, then we'll get back to this later. Mishnah Berurah, still in the Mishnah Berurah quoting, so we quoted the First Yisrael, we quoted the Ramatz quoted the Marik and the Beis Yosef. Now we're back in the Mishnah Berurah. It says also in Shut Ruach Chaim, Reb Chaim Palachi has a similar shayla in Shuvah. I'm not going to repeat it, but he quotes that even the Reifei Yisrael, many are suspect when it comes to Divrei Torah, Chilul Shabbos, not even fasting. So Tzarachi and Rav, if we can rely on them. And the Mishnah Berurah, the Bialacha concludes, and it really depends on the Rav's judgment. And it says that's the Mata Ephraim Taka says. Mata Ephraim on these Simonim says that it depends on the Einei HaMoira and his assessment. By the way, as a sidebar, I haven't researched this, but it seems a little interesting how the Mishnah Berurah is suddenly quote unquote varfing sich over here with very interesting Mar Mekoimis. Ramatz, Ruach Chaim doesn't necessarily seem par for the course. So what it seems, based on my impression at the moment, is that it looks like he copied all the Mar Mekoimis from the Stei Chemed, Marachas Yom Kippurim. Stei Chemed, of course, had these very lengthy Kuntresim, Marachas, and he brings lots of interesting Mar Mekoimis. Just to refresh for those who need to know where the Stei Chemed fits in, the Stei Chemed was printed in Varsha between the year Tafresh Aleph and Tafresh Ayin Beis, from the 1890s to the 1910s. 18 volumes were published, 13 in his lifetime, 5 after he passed away. Then the rights ultimately were sold to Chabad, to feed the Rebbe, and the Rebbe was the one who was Mesader in the current Seder. You open, you see it says, you look at the Pesach Davar, so the Rebbe explains that there used to be 18 volumes, and now we've rearranged them into 9-10 volumes, and we rearranged the order of everything, so it's a little easier to find, because the way it was printed originally was in no particular order, meaning it's marked as Aleph Beis, but they weren't printed in the Seder of the Aleph Beis. So the Rebbe was re-Mesader. Eitzer HaChachma actually has both, you could see both the original and the Kahas. And the original Marechas Yom Kippur was printed in volume 12, which says was printed in Tafresh Samach Beis, 1902, and Mishnah Brura Chelik Vav, we know was printed 5 years later in Tafresh Samach Zayin. So the timing certainly works. And if you open the Steichem and Marechas Yom Kippur, Simon Gimel Eis Hey, he starts by quoting the first Yisrael, then the Mata Ephraim, then the Shutramatz, then the Ruach Chaim. So it seems too much to be a coincidence. Now, in fact, the Mishnah Brura directly is mitzayin to the Steichem a bunch of times in Chelik Hey and Chelik Vav. Chelik Hey to Merechas Chametz Matzah, and Chelik Vav twice, what I saw, twice to Merechas Yom Kippur and twice to Daled Minim. So now the question is, for those who are inclined to look, whether there are more examples of just strings of Mar Mekaymis and Chelik Hey, Chelik Vav, let's say, where we can trace it back perhaps to the Steichem. I haven't seen if others have looked into this. Footnote to the sidebar. There's an article someone wrote a few years ago, someone by the name of Yisrael Dan Dovid. He writes interesting articles and was in a pamphlet called Hapamlein. It came out a few times here in Brooklyn a few years ago. So there's a yeshivish legend, quote unquote, that's actually especially famous in the name of that Rosh Yeshiva from Bnei Brak, that the Mishnah Brura only quotes someone from his generation by name once in the entire Mishnah Brura. Then Hilchos Rosh Hashanah, there's a vart b'shem Reb Meir Simcha that says Reb Meir Simcha. Reb Meir Simcha, of course, is the Ar Sameach, the Meshech Chachma. So the story, the yeshivish story goes, is that it's because of another famous Maisa that there was an Asifas Rabbanim, and the Chavetz Chaim was from the more hard line, and the Ar Sameach was a little more down the middle. And they had a clash, and it was a little unpleasant. So the story goes that because they had this unpleasant encounter at the Asifa, so as like to be Mephayasim, he mentions Rameir Simcha and Hilchos Rosh Hashanah. And the article talks about the big problem with this story, which is that the Mishnah Brura Chelik Vav was printed in Tafresh Samach Zayin, and the Asifa was in Tafresh Ayin, or whatever, Tafresh Ayin something, a few years later. So just chronologically, doesn't really work out. And people had already raised this. In this article, he goes into great depth and machtatel, pretty much destroys the story. One of the questions is it even true, B'chlal, that this is the only person of his generation that the Mishnah Brura quotes by name? So one of the things that comes up is, what about the Stei Chamed? The Stei Chamed was also contemporary, and the Stei Chamed is quoted a number of times in the Mishnah Brura, as we just discussed. Although there is room to be mechalak and to say that it's still different. It is unique how he's saying Shemaiti or whatever, Meir Simcha. Okay. Getting back to these Achrayim quoted by the Mishnah Brura, all after the Alter Rebbe, right? So this is a development after the Alter Rebbe. So the question is, I was wondering a bit myself, what suddenly happened? Why, for 2,000 years, it seemed like everyone was, made total sense to listen to doctors regarding Yom Kippur, and now suddenly there's a problem. So as a throwaway theory, take it or leave it, I would think that perhaps in early generations, there were many philosophies or religions, and it was pretty much universal that fasting was a good thing. Fasting was a positive thing. If it's virtuous, it can help a person become a better person, maybe even for medical reasons as well. So perhaps that was why the assumption was that if you come to the doctor is being asked all the time by hundreds of people from all backgrounds about whether they can fast for their reasons. So it was assumed that the doctor will try to answer to the best of their ability. Once you have modern medicine in the last few hundred years, so along with, first of all, you have new ideas about medicine. You also have new ideas about life in general, new philosophies, new ideals. Generally, if you went to medical school, you get the whole package, just like today. When you go for higher education, you also get the hashkafas package deal. So if medicinally there was no value in fasting, and they were dismissive towards archaic, quote-unquote, religion, so that's perhaps when they started noticing that all of a sudden the doctors aren't taking these questions very seriously anymore, and they're just answering, in the way they are because they don't see it as a serious medical question. It has nothing to do with their actual medical practice. Whereas today, where fasting has perhaps come back a bit into style, I think Rabbi Shulchan may have mentioned something like that, so it's possible that today doctors once again might take it more seriously. But as was then, today you do have to, make an assessment of the doctor and make sure that this person seems reliable. Anyway, getting back to...
That's saying you take the doctor seriously. He's not making a medical assessment right now. He's making an assessment of care for the doctor.
I suppose, yeah. So all of a sudden we see this big discussion about such a simple question, such a straightforward medical question, straightforward halachic, not so simple anymore. And in fact, in Hilchos Nida, it's truly not simple, right? We quoted before from the Beis in Hilchos Nida. If you look in the Alter Rebbe there in Siman Kuf Pei Zayin, the Mechaber writes, "V'yesh mi shematir Omer lo Reif Yisrael nisrapis." So the Alter Rebbe writes in Sikkot Lamed Vav, "Avol nochri av bishumum chalarabim ein lismach alav dekrinim behu ashapim dibershav." That's what the Alter Rebbe cites the halacha. That was the maskana of that discussion in Rishayim. Right, so it's clearly not as simple as we may have thought from just looking at the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch Hilchos Yom Kippur. Now, if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, the new Shulchan Aruch, the Metzayin, Tzemach Tzedek, Yeridei, Siman Kuf Memches. Let's take a look there to see how the Tzemach Tzedek dealt with these questions of doctors. So, the Achrein and the Tzemach Tzedek, these are often Nida-related questions, and the woman has some strange symptom, and the doctor has some theory as to what might be happening. And the question is, okay, to what extent can we work with this? So the Tzemach Tzedek begins by saying the Tshuvas Mahar Mal, lots of fun Rosh Tevis in here for Tshuvas Machrein. Mahar Mal is Maram Lublin, Siman Kuf Yud Aleph. So Maram Lublin wanted, the Shoyel, the person asking the question, they wanted to say that if the Reifim say we think it's a Makkah by Samakim, they're completely Nama. Maram Lublin answered that in that Gemara and Nida, the baskan of the Gemara is that they also did the water test. They took the klippus, they took the sinus, and they put it in the water to see what happens. So, what does that mean? What does this Gemara tell us? So, we need a test. We can't take the doctor's word at face value. We need to put it to the test. And then we'll see whether their theory is correct or not. So, we're not, their statement alone isn't conclusive. So, he's taking that same Gemara with Mardik and literally coming to the exact opposite conclusion. But even though Ram Lublin says that if the doctors are 100% confident, somehow this is like incontrovertible medical facts, then we can rely on them even if it's mamash dam. Looks like normal dam. You can rely on them. And those two stories in the Gemara are different for whatever reason. Chacham Tzvi is another Achron who discusses this, and he asks a question on Ram Lublin, and he has a different mahalach, and the Tzemach Tzedek says, the Dvarav, we rely on Reifim. Tzemach Tzedek says, I would want to explain the Maram Lublin not fitting 100% with what he said, but the general spirit of it. So he says the tshuva of Reb Leib of Mentz in the short Shin Beis Yud is Shev Yaakov in this case, Now, who is Reb Leib of Mentz? So I actually did not manage to find any official biographical information of his, but if you look throughout the tshuvas of the Tzemach Tzedek refers to this tshuva many times. So in Siman Kuf Yud Beis, which overlaps a lot with this tshuva, he writes, "Va'al hagoyin moharal zal hanal yesh lismich ki haya gam ken chacham b'chachmas refuah." This Reb Leib Mentz is also chacham b'chachmas refuah. And Siman Kuf Mem Tes, the Tzemach Tzedek calls him hagoyin harefei Reb Leib of Mentz. And Siman Kuf Aleph he writes, "Shahaya gam ken doctor," and then the other Siman hagoyin ha-doctor, hagoyin harefei. It's mentioned there in the tshuvas as well that he had some medical knowledge. Anyway, so Reb Leib of Mentz, Dafka, as a medical expert, his whole lengthy tour de force there is to make the case that doctors don't actually necessarily know what they're talking about. Takes one to know one. And he said, you have to understand that when doctors say something, don't take it as 100% factual. And yeah, it's a bit of like a classic. I'm not saying the tshuva is absolutely famous, but it's in a certain sense a classical tshuva, which he's just laying down the basic perspective on how to approach the medical field. And of course, there are many things that are absolutely not very clear, and doctors can have opposite views, completely contradictory. And in fact, many of those statements are probably true till today. Depends on what you're talking about. So there are certain medical facts that are considered davar vadai, but then when it comes to an individual person, what is afflicting this person, quite often, and studies have been done, and the amount of times that the doctors have completely opposing diagnoses is still something that's a very large phenomenon today. So the sort of Rabbi man says you can't rely unless it seems very evident, or where it's a case where you actually, the standard isn't, you don't need a halachic gemura. For that din, maybe you don't need a halachic gemura, even if you're not 100% convinced, might be enough for that halacha. And again, he brings the same raya from Nida. So you see, the way he says it is, the doctors wanted to prove what they said. The doctors themselves in that story, that's how he titles the story. They themselves, they had a theory, and then the doctors went to test it. They weren't just going to stay at a theory. So they're being murdered to the Chachamim themselves that what we say isn't necessarily a certain thing. So it could be that the Makkah is causing clippus insidus, but it could be that clippus insidus came from Dam also. Both are possible. So you need to test it. Once you test it, then you know for sure. So Tzemach Tzedek says this fits more or less Maram Lublin. The difference is the Maram Lublin said that the Chachamim didn't trust the doctors. The Chachamim insisted on the test. And Rabbi is saying that the doctors themselves insisted on the test. It says also in Tshuvas Ayin Hei Gimel, what's Ayin Hei Gimel? Avodas HaGershuni. Avodas HaGershuni also understood from Maram Lublin that the Chachamim didn't rely on the doctors until they tested them. But even for Rabbi Mentz, or even Rabbi Mentz does say that if the doctors say this is a basic medical fact, then you could rely on them. So for example, in the test itself, who said that if it's not nimoyach, that if it doesn't melt, if it doesn't come apart, who says that proves that it's not dumb? Someone had to establish that fact, otherwise what does the test prove? So ultimately, that seemed to have been considered an incontrovertible medical fact about blood in general. That's easier to establish. What's going on with this woman? We need to test that. So we can put the Maram Lublin together with the Rabbi Mentz. Then the Tzemach Tzedek says, even though Rabbi Mentz seems to accept doctors in certain situations, I'm still mesupik, because look on the Beis Yosef and Siman Kuf Pei Zayin, that Sarachin, if you can rely on the Reife. And I guess my mind is the Ritzvah. And even if the Ritzvah is Takamor Mekel and says you could rely on it, maybe a good, depending, that's only Yisr Vestus, right? Because Rei Machmas Tashmish, after all, what is the whole din of Rei Machmas Tashmish? Yesh Leimar, that it's not any worse than a Vestas Gimel Pa'amah. Vestas is the Rabbanan. So Rei Machmas Tashmish, even though we treat it in a very stringent way, but it could be that Etzem, you say that din is not so stringent. So that's why the Ritzvah might be open to listening to doctors. And the doctors had a raya in this Gemara, in the Gemara. And he says, I saw Shuvra Isi that this is also the conclusion of the Pei Mem Aleph. The Pei Mem Aleph is the Panim Iris. He's Mitzayin to other Ma'amer Kremis as well. Then he gets into the Maharik. Maharik is quoted by the Beis Yosef. But Maharik is brought out higher from Yom Kippur, right? So he says, Rabbi Mentz's Shuvah, from there, either it says it there or it's understood from there, that shiny Yom Kippur is a sveka, that's enough to be matir. Even if you have many svekas, you can be meichel. Like the Alter Rebbe himself writes in Siman Tov Yishud Ches, shekol safek nefashis hochen l'hakla afilu bekama svekas. So Bazai, Maharik Seraya from Yom Kippur is no raya to hear at all. And he goes on in this vein, and more rayas, more shakavataya, because this was a huge issue. You have many of these very serious shilas. And what do you actually do? It's hard to know what the doctors are talking about. To know the Rabbanim didn't have the capacity to really test their medical knowledge. So what are you supposed to do? You want to know the end of the tshuva? So if you look in the end of Rabbi Zayin, so the Tzemach Tzedek introduces the following idea. It says that shtaris from our koyes shel goyim, from a goyish court, are acceptable even in a case where you need edus gemura. To be moitzi mama mecheskasa, you need to aid them, but you can also accept documents from a secular court. Why? Because the dayanim, the judges, have a certain reputation, and loy mari nafshayu, they're not going to sign off on a shtar that's not legitimate. What do they stand to lose? And what if they lie? What's going to happen? The damage even won't be that much. They'll just get a little mockery. The judges aren't being dislodged so fast from their position. Still, if he's a dayan, he wouldn't be made sheker or pagan b'kvoidoi. The Rosh says, even if it's a judge that has a reputation for accepting sheikhad, you still say when it comes to Eidos Sheker, they wouldn't want to have their name. Sheikhad, my name can be dragged through the mud. But Eidos Sheker, no. So they're mamash nechshed hatas asadin, but not Eidos Sheker. It's burned in Shulchan Aruch, Shemishpatzim, and Chavches. And in that case, the zilzal isn't even so obvious. How are you going to prove the judge wrong? Even if the judge says something that, accepts something that isn't true, and the other person knows it's one person in the world, the one who is wrong, knows it's a lie. How is he even going to prove the judge wrong? And yet, if it's a dayan mumcha, it's a gnada, he should be meshaker. So, Bazai, we can make the comparison to Torah from mumchim. Loi meren afshay lohayit sheker. Back to the concept of Eidos a little bit. It's a shtickle Eidos sheker. To say that they would say that she has a makkah and then she doesn't have it. Maybe another doctor will be mezalzel in him, even though it's a chash rachik, which is what the Ramat said later. Like, when exactly are you going to confront the doctor? Tzemach Tzedek says here that just like the judge, it's not clear how we're actually going to embarrass him. Same thing with the doctor. So lachein, in this particular case, there were other tainis lahakol, and it's not that nice. So in that case, the Tzemach Tzedek actually said to be matter. And there are also other tshuvas, like I mentioned, Siman Kuf Yud Beis overlaps with a lot of these inyanim. I just want to give as an illustration the actual case of Siman Kuf Yud Beis to see what are these doctors saying and what are the Rabbanim wondering about. The shayla in Siman Kuf Yud Beis was that a woman had some kind of problem where blood was gushing from her throat every day when she got up. She did refuahs and skulas, and she recovered. And then shortly afterwards, she has a new problem. Now the dam is coming out min hamakar. Okay, so did the blood from the throat somehow redirect to the makar? It seemed like it, just in terms of causality, it just seemed like there was a connection. So that's what the Tzemach Tzedek is discussing. And in that context, he quotes Rabbi Mentz, who says that if the davar vadai, then you could accept it. He says, and the Rabbi Mentz was the Chachams, and he says, so Tzemach Tzedek says, in this case, if it didn't be done, even without a doctor, it just seems so simple, so straightforward. For sure, the blood used to go through the throat, and now it's coming out of the makar. Shina hiluchay milamayla lamata derech esemakam. And he quotes the shayla again, the shayla of the shayla. You see him, Hamish was like, stopped coming here and went there. So that it's that same blood from the neck. Maybe that's what the refuahs accomplished. Maybe whatever those refuahs did is they completely sent it in a different direction. I asked the Yiddish doctor who has an education. Yeah, the doctor says, yeah, for sure, it's the same blood. Now it's coming down. Later on in the Tshuva, the Tzemach Tzedek says, this is a Furish Alter Rebbe, there's a Kuntres Achrin and Kuf Pei Zayin, I believe, where the Alter Rebbe says, that way, so there's a Furish Alter Rebbe that says that this is not medically, physically possible. But there's other Achreinim, suddenly the Tzemach Tzedek is quoting other Achreinim, the Panameiris, the Sidvetara, and the Reife. The Reife said there's a derech. The Reife said it's a real thing. Tzarachi and Godol Amaisa. And then he says again, I spoke to the Reife Yehudi, and he said he has a whole theory, a whole explanation. Not stam, we don't know where the blood's coming from. Now I'll tell you where the blood's coming from. Originally, she had an infection in her lungs. There, when the infection it burst open, so then it punctured the actual lung. And that's the blood coming out of her body. That's a symphon. Symphon is a treifa. Why is this woman still around? Yesh leimar that whatever, the basar is protecting her, so she's living. But all the blood is coming from this nekev. So part of the question is even when the blood comes from the Bayis HaChitzin, and you have a svara to say in halacha that it's really influenced by something else, but you don't always, sometimes you say soif kol soif, it came in this manner, so it's coming. But if, without getting into all the details, if you go with this doctor's theory, then it's mamash dam hamaka, and it would not be considered dam hanida, even though it's going through the makar. This is that it could be that it's not even going through the makar. Could be it got It's not going through the derech vride harachem. It's not going through the veins that lead through the rachem. It's going through veins that go straight to the praise of Vitzav harachem. So from the lung, it somehow got directly to the canal. So this is what the Tzemach Tzedek is spending a whole tshuva on. And then right at the end of the tshuva, the Tzemach Tzedek says, "Achakach sha'alti pi Dr. Gadol Yeser, Amar shabilti yafshish yavi hadam minakav harei derech hacheder b'shem oifen." He asked the bigger doctor, and the doctor said, "Nope, that's not a thing. Blood doesn't do that." Doesn't say who the doctor was. Often, when the Tzemach Tzedek quotes from doctors, it's a Bishai, a doctor who's cited a lot by the Tzemach Tzedek, whatever. But on the other hand, he usually mentions his name, so maybe it was, in fact, someone else. The only option, the only alternative is the Gildan Adar. The Gildan Adar, I won't slip this up, but the Gildan Adar is a hemorrhoid. That's the only other source of blood around here. Nothing else. Meaning, maybe the hemorrhoid, maybe he's implying the hemorrhoid could also be, that blood maybe could exit through a hemorrhoid. I don't know if that's what he's saying or not. But, so it just gives you an illustration of what these doctors are saying and what the Rabbanim are trying to do with this information. And at least in the end, the Tzemach Tzedek says he, by the way, I have no idea. I mean, I think we all assume current medical understanding that that's not quite possible. But then again, I don't know, maybe there's some other condition that exists that could cause both things. Maybe it's not, maybe al pi halacha would still be damnida, but it is interesting if that was really what happened, that it seemed like there was a connection. Anyway, there are many other Makaitis that deal with this, and I'm not here to go through all of them. This is just to give you an idea of the discussion. Hilchos Yom Kippur, Hilchos Nida, the various sections, Machmas Makas, and things like that. And you got to get a sense of the ruach of the discussion in halacha. A lot of them are malukat in different places. And of course, when it comes to Yom Kippur, ultimately you have to, besides asking a doctor, you also have to be in touch with a Rav, Meira, Mumcha, who is known to have a mumchias in medical issues. So now, we'll leave Yom Kippur a bit behind. Let's head towards this general question about health questions in general. And al pi Torah, al pi halacha, when you have a medical dilemma, what does Torah say? How much do we rely on the opinions of medical professionals? Whether there's a debate, what if there isn't even a debate? What if it's a consensus? And of course, I'm sure everyone can think of contemporary applications to these very thorny questions. So there's on this topic, there's a not so very known shtickle at Tzemach Tzedek, although someone did point it out, bring it to my attention a few months ago, last year, I believe. There's actually a mefurish shtickle at Tzemach Tzedek. It's printed both in Yeridei Siman Shon and Daled and in Piskei Dinim Likutim. Tzemach Tzedek writes the following: Le'inyan refuah l'chayli. Comes to healing and illness. Some doctors say don't go for any treatment. Other doctors say no, you should pursue this treatment. So the Tzemach Tzedek starts with one mahal. Tzemach Tzedek says, if there's shava b'chachmu minyan, right? And Yom Kippur, when all else is equal, so we're machmir and safek b'koach nefesh. So when we're making Yom Kippur, so that's how we are able to resolve when we have a stira, a contradiction that we can't resolve. We have to look for a different principle here. What's the principle we're going to use? So the principle that Tzemach Tzedek says is if all else is equal, yesh leimar shev al tasa adif. In this case, we would say shev al taisa. It brings the Mishnah in Zvachim. Mishnah in Zvachim says that what if you have a carbon that's supposed to have matan arba, it's supposed to go on all four corners, and it mixed with the blood of a carbon that has matana echas. So the Lezer says, to play it safe, you should put it on all four corners. Shiur says, to play it safe, you should do one matana. Lezer said, if you only do one corner, you're going to be over on sigra. What about the part that needed four? And Yeshua said, no, and if you put it on four, you're going to be over on baltaisa for the part that only needed one. Back and forth. So the last thing it says is, if you actually put it on all four, you did baltaisa, and you did an actual action. Maybe you're over on balsigra, but at least so you see this principle that Yeshua uses here, Lagabi Karbanos. So the idea is we have no way to guarantee that you're not going to do something terrible. Could be either option leads to something bad. But if that's the case, if no matter what you're going to do, something bad is probably going to happen, so then let it at least happen due to your inaction, due to your inactivity. Why be actually fully responsible for what happens? That's how the Tzemach Tzedek starts. So Sheva al Taisa, if the doctors are arguing. Then the Tzemach Tzedek, which happens often, switches tracks. Kalmakim, if it seems that like these types of shtiklach are probably based on a Maisa Shahaya, without, she's not writing what the story was. Since it seems that the refuahs already helped a little, so it sounds like it already started, and now this debate is still raging. So Nidesh Asam Ploini Yafaloi, looks like it's good for him. So then maybe we could say that even if Roiv Deis, so if you also have Roiv Deis that say Likach, so unlike Yom Kippur, once you pass number 2, then you just say 200. But over here, if Roiv Deis taka say to take, and Kenya Shleimar, Achrei Rabim Lahatas. And he's mitzayin to Gemara Yuma. Umdina, Roiv Deis, when it comes to Safek Nefashos, Safek Nefashos is different. The ultimate principle we use by Safek Nefashos works differently. But here, there is no Safek Nefashos lahakol. Both sides, I guess, potentially there are Safek Nefashos. That's not helping you resolve anything. So, he says, Sheva Taisa is not so powerful versus Roiv Deis. If you have Roiv Deis, if the larger group of doctors say that the thing is fine and you should go and do the treatment, that's how the Tzemach Tzedek concludes. Of course, we're not trying to convince anybody here about anything, and then Shari Chilukim Leininalu, and anyone who's motivated can surely find the distinction in 10 seconds. But that's the Tzemach Tzedek, at least in that case, his conclusion seems to be to follow the majority of doctors in a case like this. When I looked to see if anybody quotes this tshuva, so I found that there's a whole shtickle on this in Kisvei Rabbi Isaac Shvei. Starts by quoting the Alter Rebbe and Yom Kippur and says, what about regular medical questions? Then he quotes the Tzemach Tzedek, and I in Shom to see he has a whole hezber in this inyan. We don't have time to get into everything. Of contemporary Sfarim, I only found one. There's a sefer called Shishanas Ha'amakim on halacha refuah by the Kolel Avrechim halacha refuah associated with Mayana Yeshua Hospital, and there's a section Barape Yerape with psakim from their Rav Yitzchak Zilberstein for those who are familiar. So you look there, so there's a shaila there that someone has a cancerous growth on the spine, a woman, and the woman became paralyzed. Most doctors said to do an operation, this will save her, otherwise she will die in a few months. But there's a minority that say that the surgery will absolutely take her out and kill her. She can't survive this surgery. And if she doesn't, so at least she'll live another year or two. What do you do now? So, writes that this sefer that says that ein hochen b'pikuach nefesh achar roiv shev al taisa adef dvar b'tzorechiyim, and then he gets into ha'ara taka into Yuma over there versus over here. There it's just a shaila of Dinei Yom Kippur. Here it's a shaila of the person's life. Either way, again, like we said before, either way potentially will either save them or kill them. So Zilberstein says, no, you have to follow the Rav. Why would you use any other principle here? Gives a mashal. Let's say a person's dehydrated. You have 2 buckets of water. One is going to save him, and one is going to poison him. And he has to drink one. He's fasted for a number of days. If he doesn't drink, he's going to die. He doesn't know which one's the poison. And one aide comes and says, this is the water and this is the poison. Probably rely on the aide. Do we follow an Eid Echad in the case of Pikuach Nefesh al Pi Halacha? But here you have to resolve. You have a conundrum, and this is the only available resolution to the conundrum. So we have to decide one way, and majority seems to be the most reasonable way. And then he quotes the Tzemach Tzedek. There's a Tzemach Tzedek that concludes that Lo Yishkol Hashev al Tayas Neged Reiv Deis. So it sounds like the Tzemach Tzedek holds, or what the direction of Rav Zilberstein seems to be leaning in. This is a contemporary example of the Tzemach Tzedek being quoted. Now, of course, lately, the touch on the hot button topics, of course, today the battle rages regarding vaccines. Now, a few years ago, it started with measles. So the Kravitz Ur Yisrael from Adar, Ayin Tess, they had a section with tshuvas from different poskim on the topic. I believe all of them were pro-vaccine. So we're not going to go through all of them, but just the first one, Rav Moshe Sternbuch is going through the Inyanim. And then in Ois Gimel, he says, there's some Reifim that say that's going to harm the child. But since Rabbi say that the vaccine is not harmful, so we shouldn't be chayshish to the miyuta. When it comes to Sav B'Koach Nefesh, we don't follow Roiv, like in Shulchan Aruch, Yom Kippur, Tobashit Chas. Here, following the miyut doesn't resolve the B'Koach Nefesh. In Yom Kippur, there's only B'Koach Nefesh on one side of not eating. Once you eat, you'll be fine. Maybe you over in Yom Kippur, but you'll be fine. Here, if you follow the miyut, your B'Koach Nefesh problem is just as bad. So, would you rather follow the minority and have all the majority saying that you have a problem? Or would you rather follow the majority and have a minority saying that you have a problem? Bada, you have to go Basar Roiv. So that's how Rav Moshe Sternbuch also seems to essentially use this svara, halacha l'maisa, in this question. On the other hand, just to balance things out a little bit, someone shared a zettel they hung up somewhere that Rav Yosef ben Yomin Vosner of Bnei Brak said, it wasn't written as a serious tshuva, so I don't know how seriously we have to take it, but the argument was, he said that lo yimeram nusayu, right? L'meram nafshayu. The doctors have a reputation at stake. He says, because the federal government of the United States makes big pharma immune to lawsuits over vaccines, a special carve-out that the government pays people who are harmed by vaccines, but you actually can't sue the pharmaceutical companies themselves. So, bazoi, faltered up the ganze l'meram nafshayu, now you have Reif and Goyp. A lot to take apart in there. We're not going to get into, but just an example of how the discussion is playing out in real time. Like I said, we're not here to persuade anybody, just to give an overview. Now, while we're at it, if we're already speaking about doctors and vaccines, so as a Hisafa, I would like to point to a number of interesting very interesting pieces that I found very recently in the Shas Shivas Tzemach Tzedek about the vaccines in the Tzemach Tzedek's time. And again, not convincing anybody, not trying to prove anything, but this is what you want to give your own chilukim, that's fine, but this is what the Tzemach Tzedek said. So this is about smallpox. The first vaccine famously was for smallpox. What is smallpox? Right? The pro-vaccine people like to say, you don't know what smallpox is, right? You don't know what it is because it's been eradicated by vaccines. But smallpox was once a very, so I have a few pages here from the CDC. I don't know if that's good or bad, but the CDC has a page, history of smallpox, and so they write, smallpox was a terrible disease. On average, 3 out of every 10 people who got it died. People who survived usually had scars, which were sometimes severe. This will actually be an ageya in a minute for one of the chuvas. One of the first methods for controlling smallpox was variolation, named after the virus, which was called variola, and it still is in many languages. During variolation, people who had never had smallpox were exposed to material from smallpox sores on other people by scratching the material into their arm or inhaling it through the nose, a very crude method. After variolation, people usually developed the symptoms associated with smallpox, such as fever and a rash. However, fewer people died from variolation than if they had acquired smallpox naturally. So that's how it started, literally just scraping smallpox off of someone else and inhaling it. When does vaccination begin? Vaccination began in 1796 when English doctor Edward Jenner noticed that the milkmaids who caught a related disease called cowpox were protected from smallpox. If they caught cowpox first, then smallpox didn't harm them. Jenner was familiar with variolation, and he thought, what if we could use cowpox instead to protect? So he tested his theory. He took material from a cowpox sore on a milkmaid and inoculated it into a child. Months later, he did it a few times, and this child never caught smallpox. And in 1801, he went public. He published on the origin of the vaccine inoculation. He, I believe, coined the term vaccine from the shayush of cowpox. And that's when the first vaccine took off. And it became very popular. And then it took a much longer time till the next vaccine was developed because all the rest of the vaccines didn't have this fortunate, quote-unquote, coincidence in nature that cowpox already exists in nature and is a weaker form. So the scientists had to figure out how to actually start taking diseases and somehow weakening them. So that took a much longer time. So, like we said, variola is what it's called in many other languages. In English, it's called pox. Pox refers to the sores on the body caused by the illness. If you ever heard of pock marks, which is still a term for people that have scars on their face, on their skin, pock mark is from the same shirish. It's a scar from a pock, from a pox. And in German, it's called pocken. Same word. So it turns out that Tzemach Tzedek talks about the disease and the vaccine in two tshuvas on two very different topics. So the first one is in Shut Tzemach Tzedek Simon Mem Zayin. And the shaila was that they're finding the cowpox in the dakin of the behemoth, in the small intestine of the animal. And so they were matter for them because finding those scars is a treifa. But then they kept on finding more and more. Now the question is, do we have to keep checking? Can we ignore it? What's the story? Generally, the halacha wasn't that they checked every cow specifically for smallpox. It's not on that level of requirement to check, as we discussed in the previous year about different levels of requirements for checking. So the Tzemach Tzedek says in Ois Gimel that there's another svara to be makel in pocken. What's the svara? If we compare it to smallpox, which people have, pocken sheba nashim, so we're going to say that it's mukhrach liyas l'kol behema. Essentially, every animal has to undergo this experience. Just like Moshe mukhrachim liyas be'adam l'chol ish pam echad b'meichayim. Every person is guaranteed to experience smallpox. Let's assume it's the same thing in operation here for animals. So we know b'metzias that the rei behemoths are ksherim, and all behemoths have cowpox. So what does that mean? Clearly, the cowpox only eliminates a very small amount of the sach hakoil. And then the Tzemach Tzedek quotes from a very interesting sefer. He says, "Kumosh nimtza b'sefer refuah sa'am perek lamed gimel siman tavkuf samachei." We'll get to what that sefer is in a second. Regarding smallpox, she'echad mishiva, that's the number given in that sefer, 1 out of 7 afflicted with smallpox die. So the Tzemach Tzedek says, yesh leimer, that's probably something similar for animals. Maybe you can say, no, Adam has mazla. Hashem is looking out for him. Maybe that's why so many people are being saved from smallpox. Baalei Chayim should maybe do worse than humans. And he says, what's the raya? He uses the term for vaccination. He uses the term havracha, which is the term used in the Sefer Refuah Sa'am. That was the term he coined. Mavrichim hapakin b'vnei adam. Mavrichim dafke kupakin sheheim hapakin shel behemis. The whole concept of the vaccine is you take the cowpox and inject it into the person. Alma shem kalim b'neichim yaser mipakin ativim shel bnei adam. So obviously cowpox is a lighter variant of the smallpox. So the ruba of the behemoths are clearly not becoming treif. So when is it a problem? Only if you look at the intestines, and the intestines take a look like they're in terrible shape. But experience shows that it's not such a big problem, so we should be mekel and be machshir. We follow the roiv, and even though we're cheshish for a miyat hamatzoi, this doesn't count as a miyat hamatzoi. Then he goes on to discuss this idea. And of course, whatever the maskan of the Tzemach Tzedek there is, but that's the Tzemach Tzedek discussion there. Now, what is the Sefer Refuah Sa'am? Very mysterious sounding Sefer. So if you look it up on Wikipedia, there's a fellow by the name of Mendel Leffin. Mendel Leffin is quite an interesting character. Mendel Leffin of Satanov. In the bio, the short bio is Mirdashe Tenuas HaSkala in Poland, and the author of popular writings in Ivrit and in Yiddish. Goes to his background. He ended up in Germany. He ended up palling up with Moses Mendelssohn. Last time I got him a chad, I didn't add the proper honorifics after Moses Mendelssohn, so you can add them now if you want. And at that point, he became familiar with a book on medicine, and we'll get to who that was in a second. And he translated it. The author's name was Tissot, spelled Tissot, pronounced Tissot. And he took this book. It seems that even though it was originally written in French, but it was translated into many languages, he had a German translation, and he translated the German translation into an early form of modern Hebrew. He printed it with haskamas of Rabbanim and haskama from his good friend Moses Mendelssohn. And this essentially is the sefer that Tzemach Tzedek is using as his medical guidebook, Mamish Linyane Halacha. Another reason why Mendeleev is notorious is that he also wrote a sefer called Cheshbon HaNefesh, a system for self-examination, and became very popular with the Musar movement, with the advent of the Musar movement 100 years later or whatever. Turns out, though, famously, to those familiar with these types of famous, quote-unquote, famous things, that Mendeleev apparently lifted the concept for Cheshbon HaNefesh from the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. Ben Franklin had a list of 13 midas that he held back then. Even people like that were pursuing virtue, and he came up with a system of 13 midas, and Cheshbon HaNefesh is a take on that. I myself haven't investigated both to see how closely it's just a copy. I've seen some of the defenders say that it's not mamish copy and paste, it's just inspired by it. But that's a more famous, something he's famous for. Mendeleev is also notable for coining a number of terms in modern Hebrew already in his time. They claim that the word shi'ul for coughing, for example, is a term he coined in the Nefus. And Bechlal, the early maskilim, the early people who were pushing for Hebrew, for literary Hebrew, only used biblical Hebrew, Mikra'it. And Lefin was the first to use Chazal, Mishnah and Chazal, and that influence has stayed with Hebrew till today. Anyways, that's his very, very, very interesting background. When you see the Tzemach Tzedek quoting him, the Sefer is scanned somewhere online. I did find it. Sefer the Full Sa'am, Eisa Chachma, Mefursim B'Shmoy Tisot, Me'eretz Shmaitz, Abir HaReifim B'Dereinu, Chibur Nechmod, Yotzel Erpam Yishayna Shnas Tavkuf Chav Aleph, 1761, Belashon Sarfas. It spread to the whole world, was translated into Italian, Spanish, English, Dutch, Hungarian, etc. And now he's translating it, especially for Achenu and Eretz Poilin, maybe because he thought they could use this information the most, and could help them also in Gefes and Poiskim and Pekuach Nefesh. We have Perek Lamed Gimel, Hadbakas Hapakin, and you could see what the Tzemach Tzedek quotes from him there. He also has a very cute mashal at the end, trying to prove that the vaccination is kedai. We don't have time to go through all that. Tissot, you can look him up as well, was a Swiss physician, and this was his very famous book, became very popular. And interestingly, I found someone who points out that even though the Tzemach Tzedek is talking about already, he's talking about the cow pox and the smallpox, which is generous vaccine. But if we actually read Sefer Refuah Sa'am, which the Tzemach Tzedek is quoting, it's actually referring to variolation. It's referring to pre-Jenner. It was printed in 1761. Jenner is in the 1790s, 1801. So he says, if you actually read the Ketayim in Sefer Refuah Sa'am, you see what he says. Noit lema'at mugla shel pakin. You take the pus and you make an incision and you place it inside the incision. Zeu minig yashin u'mayushin ba'artzis haidu. Goes to how it spread. And how it spread to Britain, to Europe, to America. He writes, B'chol medina b'chol ir shehi magas b'tchila kanoim v'chilkim paigim ba. Of course, the first reaction is always negative. That's its fate. It always gets greeted with that Kabbalah upon him. You can't argue with the results, he says. He says, for every 53 dead of regular smallpox, he claims only one dies of variolation. Describe exactly what to do. Then he even speaks about a similar process for measles. It wasn't a real vaccine, but again, just taking the measles and injecting it. So it's interesting to note that this sefer is even predating actual vaccination. Interestingly, the Tzemach Tzedek quotes the sefer in one other place, a number of times, but about one other inyan. When it comes to an aguna, someone who drowned, and the question being, how long can a person survive underwater? So the Tzemach Tzedek says, it's in Shut Ibn Ezra, Nuntes, Samachtes, Samachtes. So I'm quoting from Samachtes. It says, half an hour should be enough time, Kadesh Tetzi Nafshay, and often much less. But because there is a miyut who could perhaps somehow survive for longer, so that's why the Rivash is Chayshish L'miyuta, meaning even if you seemingly can prove that the person did not emerge from the water for half an hour, it's still not enough, just on the chance that maybe this person is an endurance champion. says, "Umatzasi raya ledvari mesefer refuah sa'am beperek tzrufon l'nitboim shekasa v'zel shayne." A quote in the tshuva, like it's an achron. Kvar shah hanitbo yesem merav shah tachas hamayim as a kashalach yesei. Ulefamim era gamkein shemeisu b'meshach gimel edalad minutin. Even within 3 or 4 minutes. Certainly, he starts by saying more than 15 minutes, and sometimes even they die within 3 or 4 minutes. In some cases, they can last even longer. If you pull a body out, even if a long time elapsed, you should certainly at least attempt to resuscitate them. Maybe you'll be in luck. So you see, the Sefer, the Full Sa'am says that even more than a quarter of an hour, even more than a Rava Shah, you should at least try. So this is what you see from here. One other source, and we'll conclude, one other source in the Tzemach Tzedek that has to do with the smallpox vaccination is in Shut Avnei Ezer. It's actually printed in the Modern Suffolk Lemi, meaning the authorship is unknown, but it belongs to that time and place. Now there is some overlap. I noticed there is some overlap between this tshuva and a regular tshuva, Simon Peiches. I haven't noticed that anybody pointed out the connection, and I didn't have enough time to see whether we can claim that it's 2 tshuvas from the same case or not. But there's a case where someone drowned, and one of the samanim, it was a few days, which is usually not so good, but they said they really recognized him. And what did they see? They saw gumais befanov, pock marks on his face. The pock marks where people remember that they had been. So, in the middle of this tshuva, it says about these marks, quotes, often you see in the tshuvas of Agunas, the quotes in Yiddish from the Edom, Habechem der Kant betvias ayin, der Kant, as das is Chasni, the father-in-law was saying, I recognize this is my son-in-law. So he quotes, it's the tshuva of the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef says, Mishi yesh le gumes befanov. Machmas, and you have to know how to pronounce this because it's a foreign word, but the pronunciation is virguelas. Virguelas is an archaic way of saying, in Spanish, the word for variola, for smallpox, is viruelas, and you look it up, you'll find that Amol was virguelas. So if he has gumas befanav because of virguelas, shezes simen muvik, the Beis Yosef says. She'echad me'elef lo yimatze shiur le'kein b'yeser. Only 1 in 1,000 has serious marks on their face. Whoever is writing this writes, of course, even without being familiar with the word necessarily in Spanish, this is clearly talking about smallpox, and they're calling it a siman muvik. So, the tshuva says, you can't say that in these countries. You can't say echad me'alef. Maybe in Tegar matake shesham le'hayacheli apakin klal kayidu. I don't know if that's, we have to check that, but wasn't so widespread in Turkey. So there it's echad me'alef. But mashenkim dinas elu she'ein shum yalad sh'layiyah le'pakin. So even though it's not shchiach kol kach that you have these strong pock marks, it says, but you can't call it a siman muvik. Everyone gets smallpox. But in Kol Zeh, he says we can call it a siman beinani. Why? Kol sheken lafia nog b'medinas elu mikama shanim yosem mishleishim b'arbaim shana. It's already 30 or 40 years. Lahamit kupak and la'iladim. We give the kids cowpox. So bazai, kids are not suffering from smallpox as much as they used to anymore. So now the how common it is has decreased. It's gone down. So bazai, it should be counted as a siman beinani. You have different levels of simanim and agunas. This is a siman beinani. And then if they can say, that's for the mark b'chlal. And if you can say it's b'oisamakim, then maybe it's taka a siman muvik. If you search, you'll find more svarim along these lines. Chalefen, like I said, you can come to your own conclusion. Someone just pointed out to me today that the Kfar Chabad this week printed that there's documents from Rebbe Rashab and the Frierdiker Rebbe's travels, where in the documents it says vaccinated for smallpox. That was the document they needed to present in their travels. So also just the most anyway, I want to bench you all, the Gemara Chasima Tova, we should have gesundte Yar, we shouldn't have to know from doctors. Amen.